We are of an ecosystem rather than simply an element in it. So, the history of possible connections between psychoanalysis and ecology gives us what we might today think in socialist and feminist political terms as an intersectional account of who we are and what we might be. We are, as many psychoanalysts from Freud onward have argued, beings who patch together our individual egos from our images of significant others. What we are doesn't spring from inside us, but is made by and maintained by our relations to others. We are each, to put it in more explicitly Marxist terms, an ensemble of social relations. Paradoxically, the term ecology could then be more flexible and open to change than the apparently more immediately social term community. Faith communities, for instance, are very sure of what holds their members together, as we can see when people try to leave them. It's not so much that people are prevented from leaving, though that's sometimes the case, but the dissidents can quickly be expelled, banished, subject to excommunication or disfellowship, as it's called. I think of this when I hear of one characterization of a psychoanalytic group I have now left, and I did make a choice. The characterization was that they're not a sect, in fact the reverse. In a sect, the account went, it's easy to join and difficult to leave. For this psychoanalytic group, it was difficult to join and easy to leave. To stay sane in these circumstances, you need to notice what's happening to you. Which brings me to ethnography. Ethnography. I guess one material and symbolic resource we have for surviving our journey through psychoanalytic training and acculturation in its institutions is our own personal analysis. There we should be able to complain and reflect upon what's happening to us, though there are limitations to this. One limitation for many years in many trainings was that your training analyst would report to the training committee on your progress. You can read intimations of that in Freud's letter about Tansley to Jones. One bizarre consequence here in the UK was that when gay men and lesbians were prohibited from training, and that is until quite recently in some mainstream psychoanalytic societies, queer trainees went in under the radar, not speaking about their sexuality in their own personal analysis. How bizarre is that? I heard one psychoanalyst at a conference in the 1980s in London claim that he'd never seen an analysand who was lesbian or gay. The best of analysis in these kinds of situations functions, I reckon, as reports and puzzling over experience drawn from informal kinds of ethnography, that is, as autoethnography. Autoethnography is an autobiographical tracking of the forms of discourse and practice in a strange world we encounter and then try to make sense of. Some traditions in psychoanalysis will encourage this kind of puzzling as an exploration of what they call counter-transference. Here, as transference and counter-transference to the institution, as well as to leading figures in it. Well, that's fine, but this is also where some of the dangers of looping effects start to come into play. Looping effects are described by Ian Hacking, Foucault's successor at the Collège de France, as the way in which the discursive forms we use to describe reality become embedded in the kind of subjective standpoint from which we give those descriptions. Simply put, there's a danger that talk of such things as identification, transference, counter-transference in the clinical space will also then be used to speak of relationships in the psychoanalytic institution to the extent that reference to these phenomena is not enabling us to take a distance from what we experience, but gluing us all the more tightly to it. One of the peculiarities and powers of psychoanalytic discourse is that it gives us the keys to unlock some aspects of personal political relationships, but as that discourse becomes more widespread, it also becomes all-embracing, becomes the kind of worldview that Freud himself cautioned against. Psychoanalytic discourse is no longer the key, but now the lock. For example, when I was talking earlier about rivalries between different psychoanalytic groups, you may already have reached for a phrase from Freud to name that: the narcissism of minor differences. It's a phrase that rebounds from the realm of psychoanalysis into politics and then back into psychoanalysis again, and each time, with each iteration, sounds more plausible to those who hear it and then repeat it to themselves to explain what is happening. It isn't that I don't think that the phrase is apposite, but that it may be explaining away something rather than helping us to understand it. Worse than that, it draws us all the more tightly into one discourse, psychoanalytic discourse, as if that discourse held the master key, luring us into subscribing to that discourse all the more effectively. That's why autoethnography, as the tracking of what is happening to you in a strange new ecosystem here in psychoanalysis, needs also to be able to enable you to suspend disbelief while you find your way around, and suspend belief as such in the systems of meaning you're being invited into. One lesson I take from Arthur Tansley's book on the new psychology, for instance, is the need to treat biological reference points as metaphors, part of a discourse, rather than as a bedrock and unquestionable explanation for what we are as social beings. It's that bedrock and unquestionable explanation that Ernest Jones wanted from him. So maybe it was a good thing he chose botany instead of psychoanalysis as a career. At its best, autoethnography is not so much concerned with how the meanings in a life world cohere, how things fit together to make sense, but with fracture and uncertainty, precisely with how things seem to make sense but do not. So here I bring into my autoethnographic puzzling about how psychoanalysis works two conceptual resources from politics. One is from Marxism, and that gives us an attention to contradiction, noticing how social relations are always in flux, always kept in place by systems of power, and we look for the points at which there are conflicts. Contradiction is the driving force for social change, but also a way in which we operate as always disadapted beings. That is, while conservative, evolutionary and ecological framing of social systems focuses on adaptation, Marxism, and some forms of psychoanalysis too, attend to the way the human being is disadapted, never fitting in. The other conceptual political resource is from feminism, and specifically from standpoint theory, an approach to epistemology that's concerned with the way that different positions give rise to different forms of understanding. Those who are subject to power, for instance, better see how power operates. It's often so invisible to those who inhabit and benefit from it, those who are, they think, perfectly adapted to it. Women, for feminist standpoint theory, see something of the power of men that men are usually unable to. And we could also say, that Marxism is a standpoint theory because it gives an account of exploitation under capitalism from the standpoint of the working class. Perhaps psychoanalysis too is a standpoint theory. I reckon it does become something of this kind when it comes to ethics. So let's turn to ethics. And by ethics, I mean a puzzling over the right course of action that is very different from mainstream attempts to prescribe moral rules that everyone should adhere to. So it's very different from morality. The infrastructure for that kind of system of moral rules is, of course, unfortunately in place in the realm of politics and also often in psychoanalysis. In the realm of politics, this ranges from silence by fellow travellers at oppression they know to occur in regimes they're enjoined and enjoin others to support, bad faith in the name of the greater good, to Puritanism as concerns enjoyment, so that, as I've heard so many times, you should suffer for the cause, and if you're enjoying the activity of changing the world, then there's something impure or tainted by your involvement. In the realm of psychoanalysis, morality appears in toxic form, in the illusion that they're criteria for professional conduct, and that if you're supervised by or go to personal analysis with a professional bound by preferably state-monitored guidelines for clinical work, you will be safe. There are, of course, serious attempts to build institutional structures that embed some kind of ethical sense in them instead of moral rules, and we do need to take seriously the warnings of anarchist feminists that the pretense of an absence of structure leads to more efficient exercise of power. What we might, in psychoanalytic terms, bearing in mind my caution about looping effects of psychoanalytic discourse, refer to as the return of the repressed. Among these attempts, I would include the formation of working groups with a limited lifespan, so there's a horizontal circulation of personnel around the institution instead of the crystallization of a vertical power structure. That is, the cartels as small groups with another +1 who encourages the work and notices when the members of the group are agreeing with each other too much. I would also include the giving of account of one's experience of analysis, to which I would also add experience of being in the psychoanalytic culture of a group, so that this testimony from the standpoint of an analysand is given weight instead of the assured closed narrative provided by an analyst in a clinical case presentation. That would be something like the pass, as a procedure through which one gives witness to what one's undergone in analysis and how sense was made of the process. But then, of course, each such initiative threatens to bind those without power all the more closely into dysfunctional institutional relationships with those who enjoy power. And I am mindful here of the warnings given by Alain Badiou in his little 2001 book, Ethics. Basically, in the domain of politics, science, art, and love, and we have to find a place for psychoanalysis as such in his examination of these 4 domains. In each of these there's an opening for truth and the possibility of evil. And this evil, for Badiou, is not bubbling away under the surface as a theological or biological potential any more than it is the more in socially conscious forms of ecology. It's rather constructed through a series of distortions, this evil. Those distortions are exactly, I reckon, at the heart of what it would be to imagine that everything would be fine if we could guarantee the integrity of psychoanalysis as a form of community.